welcome to EU40's event, Data Sharing and the Markets. Is the DMA doing enough? And I'm delighted to welcome you all here this morning for what I'm hoping is going to be a really exciting and insightful conversation. I am Dr. Melanie Garson of the Tony Blair Institute for Global Change. And I'm joined today by really, currently 3 fantastic speakers, but we are waiting our 4th speaker, and really experts on what we're going to consider whether the DMA is really going to meet its goals, and if it's not at the moment, what possibly needs to be done to get it there. So to help us in this conversation, I'd like to welcome Andre Kovacic, Bajana, Bellamy, and Dr. Brendan van Alsenoy, and we're hoping to be joined by Vladan Roman in a bit. I'm going to introduce all our speakers properly in a moment. But before we do that, just by way of facilitating conversation, I'm going to invite all our speakers to give us some opening remarks, and then we're going to, I'm going to take the opportunity to ask some questions of the privilege of my position. But if you have any questions, please put them in the Q&A box, and I will try and integrate those questions into the conversation and get those round to as many of our questions as possible. So without further ado, I'd like to firstly introduce Andre Kovacic, who is a Czech member of the European Parliament sitting in the Renew political group. He is a member of the Econ Committee, and in that capacity, he sits as the chairman of the working group for access to finance for SMEs. He also sits on 2 further committees, the Tran Committee and the Leave Committee. His portfolio extends from transport to tourism to border management, research and practical use of new technologies, including those based on AI and broader access and use of digital finance for businesses and consumers. He is a Renew Europe spokesperson and the group lead negotiator in the Econ Committee on the Markets and Crypto Assets Regulation. He's also been the rapporteur of the Digital Markets Act in the Leave Committee, and currently working on several files across committees on energy taxation, as well as the Social Climate Fund. Welcome, and with all that, we really appreciate you making the time to be able to join us today. Also joining us is Bajana Bellamy, the president of Hunter Andrew Kurtz LMP's Center for Information Policy Leadership. And this is really one of the preeminent global information policy think tanks located across Washington, DC, London, and Brussels. Bajana works with global business and technology leaders, regulators, policy and lawmakers to really shape global data policy and practice and develop thought leadership and best practices for responsible and trusted use of data in the 4th Industrial Revolution. So with more than 25 years experience that she's going to share with us today, with a deep knowledge of global data privacy and cybersecurity law, compliance and policy, she really does have a great industry record in designing strategy and building and managing data privacy compliance programs. And it was one of the 20 privacy experts to participate in the Transatlantic Privacy Bridge project, and really seeking to bridge those gaps between European and US privacy regimes. Bajana also received the 2019 International Association of Privacy Professionals Vanguard Award, recognizing privacy professionals for outstanding leadership, knowledge, and creativity. And she sits on the global industry and regulatory advisory boards, and we are really delighted to welcome you today with all that experience into our conversation. And certainly not least is Dr. Brendan van Alsenoy, who is the deputy head of the unit for policy and consultation at the European Data Protection Supervisor. He even has previously worked as a legal advisor and acting head of unit at the Belgian Data Protection Authority. Prior to that, he was a legal researcher at KU Leuven Center for IT and IP Law, particularly focusing on data protection and privacy. intermediary liability, and trust services. And in 2012, he worked at the OECD to assist in the revision of the 1980 OECD privacy guidelines. So really 3 stellar experts from 3 different corners to help us open and understand this conversation and see perhaps what in our little part we can do to contribute to moving it forward, to meeting what is becoming quite a rapid end goal on the pace of the negotiations. So I'd like to, again, welcome you all. Thank you so much for giving your time. And I thought I'd perhaps kick off with asking each of you to just share for about 3 or 4 minutes your sort of perspectives on really at the heart of today's session on data sharing markets and the DMA, and thinking about what do you perceive to be the really key opportunities as well as the key challenges from where it's standing at today. Andre, if I may start with you, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Melanie. Thank you all. Good morning. First of all, I would like to thank U40 and for organizing such a topical event, and I'm really honored. It's a big privilege actually to be today with you on this panel, and I think very good questions, and very in terms of the debate that we are currently going through in Europe and I think even globally, those are very right questions actually when we look at it. The key challenges and opportunities, I think that's basically, or that is how I view the entire work on the digital legislation that is actually ongoing in Europe. I think it is actually, first of all, it's sort of keep up or try to keep up with a very fast pace of evolution in digital services in general globally. I think we've seen recently, let's say in the past decade, an enormous progress and development of various services that the citizens are consuming, that the businesses are actually using, that are being developed and marketed. And I think to a certain extent, especially those online services, have by far actually went beyond what we already had in place in terms of the regulatory framework. And we realized that some of the principles that, for instance, for us in the European Union are key and basic in terms of keeping a fair and safe business environment are maybe not fully apprehended by the digital sphere. And when we look at and I think, I mean, let's say the first reaction, and I'm quite sure we will get to it during this discussion. One of the first reaction was actually to establish a very well elaborated data privacy framework with the introduction of GDPR across the EU, and I think that was one of the first steps. But coming closer to the DMA, what we see and what we are trying to react with the Digital Markets Act is the situation in the market when the global provision of the digital services is actually very much concentrated in hands of let's just several global players, and this is something that is not, I think, very beneficial for the competition in general. It's not beneficial for consumers, but also it is very risky because it creates a lock-in solutions. It creates an enhanced reliance on some types of solutions. So I think what we are trying to do is actually set much better and clear rules, which will be valid ex ante. So not the rules that we will actually apply ex post to several cases, but we will set something that should be in place beforehand, where the role of those who are actually concentrating their market powers are well described. They are also accompanied by a number of requirements, which in general, try to prevent and protect from abuse of market power, so that we can actually make sure that especially the European companies, small and medium-sized companies, those innovators who are trying to enter the digital services market are not actually blocked by those who actually occupy the largest portion of it. So I think that in my view would be, in a nutshell, the opportunity and challenge, and I'm pretty sure that we will get to it in more details throughout our discussion today. Thank you.
Thank you so much for that. Certainly given us a lot to start our conversation on. And before we move to Bajana, I'd like to take a moment to welcome our fourth speaker, Vlad Roman, who's just joined us. I will introduce Vlad in full once our other speakers have given their first thoughts, and then invite him to give his. But welcome, Vlad. We're delighted to have you with us. Bajana.
Okay, thank you, Melanie, and hello, everybody. Wonderful to be with you here virtually. And following on what Andre said, I would like to perhaps signal a couple of opportunities and a couple of challenges. I think the opportunities certainly are the right ones. EU is trying to free those digital and data markets, ensure fairer digital space in Europe, so that we can actually all benefit from this fourth industrial revolution. You know, Melanie, you say that is what we are all about. And I think there is an absolute imperative for every country, every society to actually be able to benefit from this digital revolution. But this benefit has to be fair, has to be consistent, has to be given to all. And indeed, this is the objective of the DMA. So it is very much pro-growth, pro-innovation, set of rules, pro-data sharing, right? Pro-data accessibility, ensuring data is ported and accessible throughout the EU, which I think is the right way to think about it. We at CIPL very much believe in importance of in unlocking the power of data and being able to use data in a responsible way. And, you know, economists talks about data being new oil. I don't believe that's true. I actually think data is the new environmental protection. In fact, I was actually speaking at an event where we were talking about the importance of data to deliver on green goals. And again, that's another one where you need to have the data in the system, accessibility, portability, mobility of data. And I'm so much pro this. I applaud this. But there are challenges, right? Nothing ever is easy. And Andre alluded to this. I mean, this is a complex piece of law that is kind of pro-competition, and it's premised on data sharing, but then it raises questions. Firstly, how does it fit with data privacy and data security requirements and laws of the EU? How do we marry these data sharing altruistic obligations with an access to to compliance with GDPR? And in some ways also, it is also pro-user, right? This piece of law, because it's about choice, but does choice always equate to trust? And I think that's the question, right? At the moment, we trust certain players, we trust in their privacy security postures. By having more choice, are we eroding that trust? I think these are some of the challenges. We actually wrote a paper at CIPL in December where we looked in particular, as you say, my background and our expertise is in data privacy, but you cannot look at anything anymore in isolation. Really, data policy is a jigsaw puzzle where every puzzle piece has to fit so very, very well together. DMA is one of these. Data privacy, GDPR is one of these, security, DGA, DSA, and now the new Data Act and AI, all of this needs to fit. And so our paper exposes some of these concerns on how GDPR and DMA will actually interact. We also look at the practical implementation and consequences of implementing DMA for both gatekeepers and business recipients of data. And we also look at possible solutions, particularly in the way this law is going to be enforced, how do we ensure consistency between different regulators that regulate this area of competition, right? Access to data, market fairness, and then privacy on the other side. So you know, a lot to challenge, but, you know, a lot to fight for. And dare I say, again, Europe is trying very often to lead in these discussions. And because we are leading, we are first. We really need to make sure we have got big opportunity to discuss and debate, which is why I like this session, right? It really is important to get this right. People across the pond are also looking at that. We are hearing some senators are looking at DMA and saying, what would this look like in the US, right? But it has to work for every country, and it has to work for us, our digital society. It has to work for all companies, including gatekeepers, right? This is not protectionist piece of law, shouldn't be, and it has to work for end users. So this is a big ask. So I'm delighted to go into more details, Melanie.
Thank you so much, Mona. Well, that's certainly added to the sphere of conversation, and we've got a big ask of us ahead to try and unpack all this in the next few minutes. But Brendan, building on that, where do you see the very many challenges as well as opportunities that have been put on the table so far?
Thank you, Melanie, and also thank you to the organizers for inviting me to this very important and timely debate. I think where I see the main challenges and opportunity builds a lot actually on what Andre and Bajana were already saying. So I think, the DMA, it's clear it's first and foremost about fairness and contestability of markets, right? But it's also clear that the DMA is not only concerned with competition. The DMA is also concerned with recognizing the privacy and data protection interest of end users. And working for the data protection supervisor, we see this as a major opportunity. We've been for a long time, excuse me, emphasizing the complementarity between different areas, different policy areas, in particular also competition and data protection law. And so we think that it's essential that we maintain coherence and complementarity also in practice. And so the DMA, what do I mean by this? So data protection should not be used as a means to pursue anti-competitive behavior, but at the same time, measures to promote competition should not lead to a lower level of protection for data subjects. And so already in the initial DMA proposal, we see a lot of provisions which actually try to make the link, make the cross-reference to European data protection law, like the GDPR, to try to reinforce the complementarity and actually also to mutually reinforce the respective policy objectives, because indeed more innovation, more competition, more contestability will eventually lead to more choice for consumers and potentially also a race to the top in terms of privacy and data protection. So we see, we definitely welcome and we welcomed in our opinion also the underlying objectives of the DMA, and we saw clear synergies and rooms for complementarity, restrictions on combining data across services, making sure effective portability, which Bajana also already mentioned. And so while we think, the basic principles and the ideas are there, it's also really important that actually this goes forward and works in practice. And so that's where we also see perhaps potentially the major challenge is to make sure that we have this consistency and this coherence, once the DMA is adopted and going forward. So, because the major risk that we see, and this is not just limited to Digital Markets Act, we kind of see this also to other, recent regulatory initiatives where basically, there's a dedicated oversight structure which is being put in place. But there's a risk that if we have, let's say, different competent authorities looking at the same problem, the same players from different angles, if there is no mechanism for structured cooperation between the two of them, there's always a risk of, let's say, having fragmentation. And we think that type of fragmentation would be particularly detrimental, not just for industry, but also for citizens alike. So that's why we recommended, or one of our key recommendations at least, was to provide this framework for a structured and institutionalized cooperation. And we really think that by working together, competition and data protection authorities and other relevant authorities can really make sure that the DMA delivers on its potential. And we can achieve both the objectives of the DMA and also further advance data protection and privacy in the process. So that's it for me for my opening reflections. Thank you.
Thank you so much. And I'd like to now introduce Vlad Roman, who's joined us. Vlad is a young professional with strong interest in EU affairs, focusing on the union's policy and regulatory systems as a means of fostering better market structures and innovation. He currently serves as a diplomat at the permanent representation of Romania to the EU, dealing with competition, state aid, platform economy, and better regulation portfolios. Vlad joined the diplomatic services shortly before Romania began holding the Council of the EU rotating presidency and chaired one of the expert level working groups. Previously, he comes to us with expertise as a case handler for antitrust cases at the Romanian Competition Authority. And besides this professional activity in law enforcement and public policy and regulatory affairs, he's published widely in academic law journals and is both an alumnus of Lund and Malmö universities with an LLM in business law, as well as global political studies from Sweden. And he's always reached out to like-minded communities to support and advance good society values, including being part of Aspen Young Leaders and other leadership programs like Leadership for Justice. So Vlad, we're delighted you were able to make it onto the call, and we're really looking forward to hearing your perspective. So you missed at the outset just a few thoughts thinking about the title of this session and what you see the opportunities and challenges to be.
Great. Good morning, everybody. I hope you can hear me. Great. Good morning, Melanie. Good morning, colleagues. So, yeah, first of all, apologies for being a bit late. There were some connection problems. And I'd like to thank you very much for inviting me to contribute to this distinguished panel. First of all, I'd like to also say that the views and opinions expressed in this debate are my own and do not necessarily reflect the official position of any public body. So basically, my first intervention will be more principle-based and focused on the structure and governance on the DMA. And then I'm happy to go more granular and maybe address specificities of the data angle in this file. To start with a bit of history, as you said, Melanie, I joined the Perm Rep just before the Romanian presidency. Back then we were actually dealing with the first platform economy file dealing with business-to-business relations in the digital markets. That was the platform to business regulation. So that was a fresh start. And the DMA would be basically a follow-up, given the fact that at that moment there was already a political will for more regulation of big tech companies, especially if one looks at the European Parliament report from that time. However, given the horizontal nature of the platform to business regulation and the lack of threshold-based approach, most of the obligations in force at the moment are only amounting to transparency requirements. So now, 3 years later, it's still February, but 2020, we can see that departing from the traditional antitrust doctrine and by allowing for self-executing bans or obligations, the DMA is set to become a policy in its own right. So in the benefit of timely enforcement, the DMA leaves aside case-by-case market definitions, economic efficiency exemptions, or effects-based analysis, all parts of the competition analysis. It gives primacy to a set of obligations that are being ex ante considered as harmful in all situations. This will indeed also be complemented by competition law enforcement, which can come as parallel to the DMA or intervene in areas not covered by the ex ante provisions. Here, to clarify a bit, it needs to be stressed out that whatever is not in the DMA does not mean that is necessarily legal. In the future, there can be cases where specific practices not covered in the DMA at this moment can be found illegal, but after employing a more thorough analysis under the antitrust regime. In the same time, there are some future-proofness safeguards in the DMA, like the delegation of power to the Commission to further incriminate varieties of illegal practices without a need for formal review of the Act. And in my view, here complementary antitrust and DMA cases, whether national or EU level, should benefit from an unparalleled coordination and enforcement stream, accommodating the new instrument alongside the current competition framework. And I think that European Competition Network is very well placed to deal with this transition process, but indeed, of course, also involving other regulators like data protection regulators, telecoms authorities, alongside with to feed in the analysis of what kind of market concerns there might be at stake. And for this reason, the question if the DMA is doing enough for markets should be answered by looking towards the whole enforcement system and how it will safeguard market opportunities in terms of entrance and innovation. So here I would be pleading for a more systemic approach in understanding the real benefits of the new policy. I guess it's really tempting to try and solve everything with the DMA, but in the same time, we need to, always remember where we come from, our legacy in terms of the already existing regulations, and what's there already tested in the market that we see as harmful in all situations, and codify them at the beginning as ex-ante bans, and maybe further on as the practice develops, follow up. The Commission can follow up in a very flexible way through the delegated act, or we can follow up when we revise the policy to further on develop it. So that was my preliminary stance. Thank you very much, and looking forward to engage in further discussions.
Thank you so much, Vlad. Well, we've certainly bitten off a little more than we could chew, I think, here, but to get it started, I think what has been really interesting that we've heard from all of you is that these certain sort of friction points that are coming into play, and you've all alluded to different levels of possible practical solutions that can be built in to address these friction points, and particularly between consumer protection, competition, and data protection, sort of, and both the values behind all those from an EU perspective and the values behind, or the goal of keeping innovation live and active in the playing field. So I wonder whether we could explore that a little bit more and see sort of what your thoughts might be to the extent of what are the practical steps that can be taken at this point to mitigate or reduce this friction before, sort of as we're still in these negotiation stages. So going back, I guess, into the order we came out, Andre, do you have any thoughts?
Thank you. Well, I think the practical steps should be mainly done by negotiators behind the trial table. I think they are the closest to the matter. But I think many issues also linked to it were already mentioned, and in the end, the key will be, I think, in the enforcement of the DMA, together with obviously all the other relevant legislation that is currently in place. And I think in this regard, also based on what has been said by previous speakers, I think it's really about setting also in terms of institutional setup a good coordination and cooperation mechanisms which will basically make clear that the relevant angles are always taken into account when the cases based on the DMA law are considered. And I think, I mean, just for a couple of examples, I definitely agree with Brendan in terms of better sort of coherence between DMA rules and the GDPR. when I was drafting together with my colleagues the opinion of the Libe committee in the Parliament, we've taken on board a number of recommendations from EDPS actually in the draft opinion, where definitely one of these aspects was to ensure that there is a coherence. For example, we were asking or basically relaying the recommendation from the opinion on involving the European Data Protection Board or the data protection authorities in the member states, involving them in the market investigations, but also to be able to share with them the findings that the Commission will have throughout their market investigations or other considerations that they are currently giving to relevant cases. And I think this is also an important point, because it was mentioned. One of the reasons why some of the business operators, some of the digital service providers, actually managed to get such an important market size and power, it's actually based on the access to data and the use of the data, and we have to take this into account also when we speak about, let's say, in normal case, pure competition rules. I think it would not exist anymore in this way. It's actually a set of policies that we have to put together when we consider those cases. Another example, if you look at the position of the European Parliament, so the final mandate for the negotiations with the Council on the DMA, there was this proposal or a call for creation of a European high-level group of digital regulators, which I think is in the end could be one of the answers to those frictions, as you mentioned, Melanie, because this is exactly to see where the different stakeholders can actually come in and bring in not only their expertise but also their competence and their authority. If you look at the DMA and the enforcement, let's say from the top level of the European Commission, there is definitely in a number of other areas a case to involve other European or national authorities in various regards. And I think this is exactly behind the idea of creating such a high-level group, to bring together those aspects, so that it's actually the final outcomes of in the investigation, but also of let's say the implication of the DMA legislation in practice, is actually as broad and coherent as possible.
Thank you so much. Now, I've seen Bajana and Brendan both nodding away, and I know that just to expand on that, I'm sure you both got a lot to say in response, but also I think Bajana, and I know that your paper that you recently published sort of expands on quite a lot of it, but perhaps could you also develop a little bit more sort of the areas where you think that there's potential to fall through the cracks and the burden that might place on organizations?
Thank you, Melanie. I think that really would be helpful. Maybe kind of three areas. I mean, one is this whole premise of gatekeepers will have to enable real-time, continuous access to data, which could be personal data, could be aggregate or non-aggregate, could be anonymous as well, to business users. So these could be third companies, right? Their own business recipients, business users, but could be competitors as well. And could be some others that will be designated by the Commission. So we have this kind of concept of data sharing, and it's not new. I mean, I remind people PSD2 directive was all about opening financial markets to fintech. But what is new here is we've got to first of all, it's not a sectoral a law, it's cross-sectoral, applies to all data, to all sectors, and to all business recipients. So I think there really are some very practical implications and questions to be asked as to how do you ensure that data sharing is done in compliance with GDPR? Because DMA, Andre is right, says, this law will be all the provisions will be done in compliance with GDPR, but what does it really mean practically? I think there are going to be quite a number of significant compliance issues, both on gatekeeper side and business recipient side, in order to ensure that compliance. It may require DPAs to slightly also move their interpretation of the laws. DPAs are very reticent at the moment to recognize anonymous data as a category, because it's always possible to re-identify data. Well, you know, if a gatekeeper is sharing anonymous data, that is actually privacy protective, but we can't sort of start finding holes in that, right, from DPA side. But some of the tensions here are on the fact that, as I say, it's a mixed set of data, right? Secondly, how do you comply with this legal, and I go into more legal grounds here, but what to do, it's this technical, right? You know, GDPR is a well-balanced law. It allows for a number of legal grounds for data sharing, and we cannot just think that consent would be the only one, the consent of end user. I don't believe that's right, because there may be other legal grounds that would enable that data sharing as well. How does it all fit with transparency, purpose limitation? Can the business recipient that gets the data use data for different purposes, their own unrelated purposes? You know, these are going to be the questions that somebody is going to have to answer. And then, you know, we suggest some of these answers. There is also this tension between privacy and security. Obviously, sharing big data sets implies and triggers all kinds of security concerns, both on the gatekeeper and the recipient side, and the API that enables that data sharing as well. And I think, you know, do we have to do, as a gatekeeper, would I have to do a due diligence of the recipient of data? Whose obligation is it? Whose breach is it if there is a privacy breach? So, you know, it is technical, but it has to be answered. And just by saying this will be done in compliance, I don't think it kind of addresses the point. Second point is to just show you how there are different interests in this, Melanie and others. I mean, I think the whole point about rule which says you cannot combine data across different platform services unless individuals give their consent. Yes, I mean, that is privacy protective. That is also there to sort of, you know, ensure fairness. But I mean, do we want to be burdened by even more consents around our use of data? There would be very valid reasons when platforms should be sharing data to ensure security, to ensure safety within services, to ensure integrity, to avoid fraud. I mean, remember, we've got this other type of legislation, DSA, which requires these platforms to do lots of things to ensure all the harmful and unlawful content isn't there. So they're going to have to do that, but then they will have to combine the data, because otherwise you will never be able to comply with that law, nor actually ensure all of this safety security. In GDPR, we would have a legitimate interest ground for processing that sort of data, but DMA, it's a bit of Andre, it's a good law for what it does, but it's a blunt instrument of data protection. You know, GDPR is well balanced. It has got all these levers and pulls, risk-based approach, right? Which accountability, multiple legal grounds, and DMA doesn't. And so I don't like when DMA provides strict rules that relate to data protection. I think that really should be left to GDPR. There is a bigger conceptual issue here, in my view, is that if GDPR is a horizontal law, and now we've got all these verticals, right, from AI to DMA, DSA, and Data Act, if they're all, and e-privacy, if they're all chipping away from GDPR, what is GDPR for? You know, we can't over-regulate and regulate again the things that have been done in GDPR. So I would say refrain from using these kind of blunt instruments. And the third point is the side loading. I think that's very is discussed a lot, right? And raises all kinds of issues. And I'm sympathizing with both sides of the argument. I often do. It's my job to kind of understand everybody's argument, but I do understand the point. And this is why I said choice doesn't mean trust always. I was at a session where this was being discussed, and there was a gentleman from a startup, a German company startup, who also is active in the kind of developers association. And he kind of said, nobody's asking us. We actually do not want to have our apps on multiple platforms. We actually do like having them on a safe, secure platforms where we know platforms is going to provide us the sort of environment where we can host this with trust. He said, apps are not shampoos. You can sell shampoos in any supermarket, but you can't sell apps anywhere. And so, I kind of understand the wish that big platforms are investing hugely in privacy and security on their platforms. In fact, DPAs love that. And now we are asking them to stop investing because guess what? People can host apps elsewhere and not be tied to the single platform. So I kind of feel, yes, competition, yes, choice, but what is really, which of our two heads do we have in every single case? And I'm not sure we really have gone deep enough to ask the right people, what do you really want and what do you care about? So I've surfaced some challenges, sorry, but you have asked me to do that, right?
Well, I'm sure Brendan, I'm going to Brendan and Vlad are both chomping at the bit to get into that. And I can see also Andre's got a few thoughts coming back that. But as Brendan, you were sort of, I also mentioned directly in some work, so much to think about it. Is it a blunt instrument? Is there a way to mitigate this tension between the verticality and the horizontality within it? What can you help us to bring to us to help us understand this a bit better?
Great. So thanks a lot, and also for all the food for thought from the previous interventions. I think, indeed, when it comes to reducing frictions, I think first and foremost, we need to make sure that the text, the concepts are solid and that they're not, creating, potential risks of inconsistency. So again, here we thought that already in the initial DMA proposal, there was already quite a solid approach. We just, had some ideas for, more specific, we have to be very careful when we throw around words like, aggregated and non-aggregated data and personal data and non-personal data in the same sense. We also have to be careful when we think about, opening up certain types of data like, search data, query data, click data, which could potentially, be very difficult to anonymize in practice. And we really need to make sure that anonymization requirement is effectively implemented if we want to, avoid some of the incidents that have occurred in the past. So, but I do think at the end of the day, it's not a question of, conflicting interests. It's not about competition versus data protection. It's about competition and data protection. And I do think that, user control, user choice is a very important element of that. And I also think that proportionality and data minimization also remains an important part of the story. I think, obviously, we do not want to result in a situation where, for example, security or privacy of end users is going to be undermined. But I also think that we need to be careful when we think about, to what extent, combining data across services is actually necessary, to preserve privacy and security, because it seems to be based on, in a way, on a premise that suggests that other service providers who do not offer multiple different services across different platforms and are able to generate and collect that data might be able to then actually also effectively ensure the security of their systems and services. So I think, I do think there is going to be, a long conversation ahead, not just in terms of getting the DMA done, but also in terms of making it work and interoperate, in practice, also at the policy level. And so I think the most important thing from our perspective is to make sure that we don't, that we have the right mechanisms, that we don't wind up with a regulatory siloed approach, that we have the ability to bridge those gaps and to have, open exchanges and make sure that, when regulators take action, there is consistency, there is coherence, there is legal certainty, and there is also due account for the privacy and data protection interests of end users.
Thank you so much. And Vlad, who's waited so patiently to share his thoughts on this. I mean, is the logic and proportionality right on this? What would you say?
Thank you very much for the question. I guess it's not an easy one, given the fact that, when you look at the data angle within the DMA, you figure out that 5 out of 7 data-related provisions are placed in Article 6. So that means that they might be subject for regulatory dialogue. And eventually, if the Commission considers so, they can be further clarified. And here, there's three main clusters of articles that relate to data. First would be the use of data, and you have that in Article 5, the opt-in for personal data combination and deep consumer profiling. And then you also have it in Article 6.1a, the separation of data sets. Also, there's an obligation to inform on consumer profiling on Article 13. I'd also count in data on advertising, as this is already being addressed in 2 articles of the DMA. That's Article 5G, transparency in advertising and intermediation, where it looks at the price parity, and then it also, you have another provision in Article 6.1g, the same transparency regime, but in terms of performance. And of course, there's another cluster of 3 articles in Article 6, of 3 provisions in Article 6, and that amounts to data access and portability. Here it relates to access to data generated by users of business users, data portability as such, and access to search data, which is specific to search engines. So given the fact that the data problem in the DMA is being addressed through such an extensive setup of articles, we need to admit that the market failure is there, and there needs to be, intervention in this regard. To point out at the particularities of Article 5a, the opt-in for personal data combination, and the fact that the GDPR regime or the legislator is moving slightly from the GDPR regime in terms of the exemptions allowed, I guess, at least from the competition policy perspective, we've been used with this kind of approach in terms of market intervention. As we all know, there's this special responsibility of the dominant undertaking, and there are specific practices that are being allowed under a dominance threshold and which are not allowed above a dominant threshold. And I mostly look at vertical restrictions, distribution agreements, and so on. So this type of logic has been feeding different other policies. And at least in my understanding as a former competition law enforcer and now a competition policy practitioner, I would say that it's just, the same type of approach, but just that now is being placed in the interaction with the GDPR. Basically, the legislator considers that this kind of exemptions in Article 6 were maybe prone to be abused, or maybe prone to give too much leeway for the gatekeepers in terms of the main objectives of this file, which of course they relate to data protection, but let's not forget that the main objective of the DMA is market contestability. So this is an overreaching special objective, which comes on top of what we already have in terms of European acquis with regard to data protection, unfair trading practices, and so on. So, of course, it's not an easy discussion, but as far as we admit that this is the new policy orientation, and that whatever there's an interaction between the two of them, the DMA prevails in terms of the overreaching aim of market contestability, then I think the discussion can be a bit more streamlined. Thank you very much.
Okay.
Thank you. Well,
can I make a comment, Melanie? Is this?
Yes,
sorry.
I was going to. I'm
okay.
getting time has flown.
I know.
So a very quick one, but the floor is yours.
So, very quickly, I appreciate what Vlad you have just said, and I understand sort of the drivers and policy objectives of this particular part of the legal instrument. But the question with combination of data and consent, if you look at the DMA, there are several places where sort of, you have to obtain consent. And in policy generally worldwide, but in Europe as well, we are moving away from consent. We cannot keep burdening people in this new digital world where people are going to be nonstop consenting as they go about their life. I spoke to one of the platforms who told me that if they were going to be doing the consents a la DMA style for combining, and this is beyond the need to do this for security, safety, they would have 3 core services, 18 consent flows. So that means 18 times I would have to give consent for each of these. So you can't just give one-off consent. It has to be GDPR style consent. And GDPR consent is very high bar, has to be specific to the processing operation, specific to the particular use of data. It has to be freely given, can be withdrawn as well. So if you have got that bar, that high bar GDPR style, and you transpose that like a graph, like, you're doing graphing onto the DMA, it just doesn't work. And the same is with e-privacy. I mean, GDPR has balanced very well the fact that in this new world, we had to put onus on companies as opposed to us to keep consenting nonstop. But now these other laws are just adding and adding and adding the instances of consent. And this is really what worries me, because the outcome will be consent fatigue. You have seen the disaster we've got with the cookies consent. It's doing nothing. And people will simply be ticking the boxes, not understanding, particularly if we apply the GDPR style high consent, which is what I think we have to do, right? Because otherwise this law will really become lex specialis and then GDPR stops. I zip now.
And that I can't believe. I would love to carry this on, but unfortunately we're far, so it could easily have been 2 hours, and the trilogue will definitely be a lot longer than this. But I guess to wrap it up and to try and bring this all together, I think some of the outstanding questions I'd love to sort of say, if each of you can give me about 1.5 minutes on your thoughts of, firstly, what still stands out to me here is who still needs to be spoken to in this? A lot of you you've all mentioned coordination and complementarity and thinking about there's still people outside this conversation. So I'd be really interested in your thoughts about who still needs to be brought into this conversation. When should that be in this process? And just to sort of be a little bit of kind of prophetic vision and sort of where are we going to go to from now? What do you think we're going to see? And Andrzej, if I can throw that at you first, so put you in the hot spot with all that first.
Yeah, thank you. I'm actually maybe I'm a bit biased, but I'm working on DMA. I've spoken to so many stakeholders that I don't have a like first-hand feeling that someone's actually left behind at this point. But I think, well, definitely the points that we addressed here, especially regarding the consumer protection and the data privacy, would definitely require a very close involvement of not only data protection authorities but also consumer protection organizations and basically those who are actually also fighting for digital rights for users. And I'm pretty sure that a lot of them are already active in this regard. This debate is actually it's not new. It hasn't started via DMA. It was actually launched much earlier than that. I know that there was a lot of actually similar, if not identical, concerns when the GDPR actually was set in force, and there was a lot of actually doubts about how the mechanisms will be established, whether they will function or not. And I think the same thing will happen with the DMA. We have to actually make sure that, as it was said, that the rules that will be set are clear, that actually they involve the most relevant aspects, but I think the most of it will happen throughout the enforcement, and we may be and I'm pretty sure we will come across some of the issues that will be raised by just the practical enforceability of the DMA, the way it's done. But I also hope because we sort of tends to have European legislation that is drafted based on the current situation all around us. I really hope that the DMA will be also something that can actually set the regulatory framework that will stay with us for some time, so that there is a predictability, there is stability, there is also possibility. And I think that this is valid for all of us. It's valid for the gatekeepers. It's valid for other business or digital services providers, but it's also valid also for consumers. We have to actually set the framework. We have to be clear on the rules, but those rules should be predictable, stable, and be if needed adapted to the current situation, but to actually leave them as they are, so that everybody can sort of adapt to them. And I think this is also valid. I agree that the issue of the consent and other issues is sometimes or can be sometimes burdensome, but I'm pretty sure that there may be also some new technological and other answers to it, and if we leave enough room for that as well, I'm pretty sure that we can overcome many of those concerns that we identify right now.
Perfect. And Brendan, let me go to you for your quick one leg sort of thoughts and prophetic vision.
Very quick, and actually I think also building just on the way that Andre closed. So indeed, lots of stakeholders impacted, not just DPAs, also consumer protection authorities, civil society, industry. But I think, definitely what needs to be part of the conversation going forward is a cross-disciplinary approach. This is not just, conversation for policy people, a conversation for lawyers, but there are very important, technical, practical dimensions to this. And so we think that, things like engineering, data protection by design and privacy-friendly solutions, when we think about, making data available to competitors, et cetera, these are going to be very important things for which, we need a broader community to work on these matters. So there's always going to be some degree, of just plain accountability. Organizations are going to have to come up with solutions to address these rules. But we do hope that, by having, let's say, a broader conversation, regulators, industry, technologists, civil society, we are going to find ways to make this work in practice. And again, it shouldn't be a trade-off. It should be a complementary thing, and we believe that it can happen.
Thank you, Brendan. Vlad, any last thoughts for us as time goes fast away against us?
Thank you, Melanie. I'd just like to pick up on Brendan's and in terms of cross-policy. And indeed, this is here to stay. And of course, this needs to be accommodated within the DMA. And there's sufficient wording for this, I'd say, in terms of bringing along other authorities which are not part of the European Competition Network and making their voice heard and their expertise valued within the assessments. But this type of model is also being employed by the DSA. So there you also have the Digital Services Coordinator, which will have a lot of other authorities in coordination, and each of them dealing with a specific part of the market. And also not to forget our legacy competition policy, where you already have a couple of parts in Europe or outside Europe where there's protocols between competition authorities, telecom authorities, GDPR authorities in terms of who's best placed to intervene. So I guess from all this holistic interagencies type of approach, there's only going to be merits for better and more efficient enforcement, which will further educate the policy. So this would be my final remark. And thank you very much.
Thank you. And certainly one that even helps it move forward. Bajana,
yes. Okay, so I agree, absolutely. So regulatory cooperation is going to be very important, and it must be institutionalized. We have seen some interesting examples with the Digital Regulatory Cooperation Forum in the UK, and it's been picked up in Netherlands. There is a good example in France, but also innovative regulatory tools. We hugely support regulatory sandboxes. I wonder whether this would be an interesting case where we can have privacy, competition, consumer protection sort of jointly going, considerations going through the regulatory sandbox with three agencies. And finally, I would like to see more co-regulation in terms of codes of conduct, perhaps a model data sharing agreements. What does a good data sharing agreement look like, that where we can specify some of these frictions and resolve them, and that I think will help the market as well. So looking forward to the fact that we need to work much more on this, right, as we implement it.
So many things I want to take away from there. Andre, you're nodding. What would be the one thing you think you're going to take away on our behalf from this conversation?
No, I think it was just perfectly summarized. I think the key would be, well, I think the story will only start with the agreement on DMA. We will have to learn also through the enforcement process, and I think the key would be really not to say that the DMA is actually going against or as a trade-off to everything else, but it is yet another piece of like legislation on the European level that will be valid for the entire single market, which is, I think, also important, which will complement those pieces of legislation that are already established within the digital environment. And I think we should make it as functional as possible for our sake.
Well, thank you so much. I apologize for overrunning and taking a couple of minutes more of your time, but it's been such an exciting and really interesting conversation. Thank you so much, Andre, Bajana, Brendan, Vlad. It's been a really refreshing and interesting start to the end of the week. And thank you to EU40 for bringing everyone together. And there's so many exciting ideas here, from regulatory sandboxes to model agreements, to really think about coordination mechanisms across horizontally, to really think about how we get to a legislation that's coherent, implementable, effective, and really keeps innovation and privacy and protection at its heart. So I'm feeling very inspired. I hope you all too. Thank you so very, very much for joining us. And it seems like we've got lots of material for another conversation very soon. Thank you, everyone. Have a lovely weekend.